Hey, I'm Ethan with GoBuilda, and today I'm going to show you how to rig a belt-driven Viper Slide kit. Here I have a two-stage Viper Slide kit assembled as far as the assembly instructions will take you. I also have the 5-meter length of belt, a 3mm hex key, and the belt clamps which are included in the kit, and a way to cut that belt. I prefer to use side cutters. I've also got a 4-stage Viper Slide kit, also most of the way assembled, that will go over any specific details that you need to use for the 4-stage a little later on. But for now, we'll focus in on the 2-stage version of this kit. Now, like I mentioned, this is assembled following the PDF assembly instructions on the website. You should be able to slide that in and out. Your motor should be installed along with the timing belt and this new idler pulley. Now, this idler bearing is pressed pretty close to the teeth of the timing belt pulley that the motor uses to drive the slide in and out. This buys us some additional wrap around the pulley, which helps improve the amount of force we can generate with that belt before it skips. And it's also placed close enough that it's another level of difficulty for the motor to be able to skip the teeth on this belt. Now that makes it slightly harder to feed the belt through this idler bearing, but as long as we do everything in the right steps, it shouldn't be a problem. First, I like to extend the slide as far as it'll go, and we'll take our timing belt here. Now, we're not going to use nearly all of this belt for this 2-stage kit, but it's a good amount extra just in case you make a miscut. All right, first up, we'll unspool a little bit of this belt here, move our other slide out of the way, and we are going to start by feeding the belt through that idler bearing I mentioned earlier, and to do that we're likely going to have to rotate the pulley on the motor. Now with a 435 RPM motor like we recommend for this kit, that's no big deal, and you can even likely pull on that belt to feed it through. Now this should be a pretty smooth process. You shouldn't feel any binding. And the important piece is that as you're pulling belt through, you make sure that it doesn't twist at all. A twist in the belt run will of course make it a little less efficient and could potentially mean you can't extend or retract your slide all the way. Now after we went through this idler bearing, we went through this idler bearing that's attached to the U-channel. We went underneath that timing belt pulley shield and on the top side of that bearing. We'll come down to the bearing that's fixed to that same low side U-channel, and we'll go from the bottom up through that bearing, again through the pulley shield. Now in the next stage, we'll go back and over and up. We'll feed that up through the bottom of that next bearing. Now through this process, you should be able to always keep spooling more belts off of your spool here, and I like that because it means you aren't working with an excess amount of belts all at once. Now continuing to make sure it doesn't twist, we'll feed over to the idler bearing that's on the same stage as the one you just threaded through, and go up through that bearing through the pulley shield. Now we're going to start working with our belt clamps because we've reached the end of this 2-stage Viper Slide kit. Now these belt clamps are made of steel. They're actually bent in 2 corners to create that U shape, and on one side is an insert that has some threads. Now, to use this belt clamp, you'll need to go through the through hole, the non-threaded side, and into the threads on the insert there. This means as you tighten that screw, you'll actually clamp. You'll push the 2 sides of the steel belt clamp together. If you go in from the other side, so it's threaded into the threads first, there will be no clamp action that'll hold this on, and these can just slip right off. Your belt clamp will lose its tension. Now to use these belt clamps, we're actually going to rely on the teeth of the belt meshing together after we wrap them around this spacer. So we'll go ahead and slide this belt clamp on. I like to put the socket head, the drive of the screw, on the upward side of the assembly. I think that makes it just a little bit easier to tighten that once you have it installed. I'll wrap the belt around that spacer, and I'll leave just about 20 millimeters of space on the far side of the spacer. Now I'll press those 2 belts together, teeth side towards each other, and slide the belt clamp over those 2 pieces of belt. I try to get it fairly close to the spacer itself, and then we can go in with our hex key and tighten that up. Now, you don't need to tighten this a ton. All the belt clamp has to do is stop those teeth from being able to jump past each other. At this point, we've rigged the extension side of this slide. Now we just need to rig the return side of the slide. So we'll take our the bulk of our belt here, and we will apply some tension. This will extend the slide out all the way until we find about an appropriate amount of belt to use to reach from the pulley on the motor out to the second standoff. I'm going to cut this fairly long just to make sure I don't cut it too short, but to get a bunch of this excess belt out of the way. This will stop us from having to pull our belt clamp through a ton of excess belt. So we'll make a first cut here with plenty of slack, and I expect us to cut that belt again in a little while. Now that we've got this wrapped around, we can go ahead and add our second belt clamp. I'll go ahead and install the screw, and we'll do that same process where we slide the belt clamp over the belt. We'll wrap our belt around that spacer, and we'll mesh the teeth together. Now, one of my favorite parts about using GT2 belts to drive slides is that you have a really easy and pretty intuitive way to tension the belt. So right now, we'll mesh those teeth together, we'll slide the belt clamp over, and we'll feel for tension. Ideally, we're looking for this to be fairly tight. You should be able to pluck it like an instrument string and hear something like a note. Now, this is obviously too loose, so what we'll do is we'll pull the belt clamp back off, but I like to keep holding those teeth in mesh. That way I can grab the end of the belt, increment it, so pull it one tooth tighter, and I know I have made this belt 1 millimeter shorter. Now I still have to keep going, but as long as I keep holding those teeth in together with my right hand, I can use my left hand to kind of feel for the tension. So I'm actually going to increase this by quite a few teeth here. I think I want to go probably 2 more. Now this is a fairly good spot. This is about as far as I can take the tension without taking the belt off the slide, which is what we'll do next. So I'll feel for that. That's okay. I think I still want to go by a little bit more tension just to make sure this doesn't skip. So what I'll do at this stage is slide the belt clamp further on, and I'll actually, while making sure the belt clamp is far enough away from the spacer, I'm going to pop this loop of belt I've made off the spacer. Now making sure to hold those teeth together so I have a reference for where I am, I'm going to add I'm going to take about 3 millimeters out of the length of that belt. So I'll count 1, 2, and 3. Missed one there. Keep that meshed together, slide our belt clamp back over, and I should be able to have a pretty accurate way to really fine-tune the amount of tension I have. Now, as you get to increasing the tension, you may have to grab the slide, but you can snap that over that button head. Once it's installed, it sure isn't going anywhere. And once you slide that belt clamp closer to the spacer, you should be able to hear a little bit of a ring from that belt. This is an amount of tension that I'm a lot happier with. We can go ahead and tighten the screw on the belt clamp, and I think we can go ahead and cut this excess belt to length. I'll still leave a little bit of belt just so that I can go back and continue to adjust the tension in the future, but that's a pretty solid space to land. I want to make sure that I can move the slide in and out smoothly. You shouldn't hear a lot of binding or excess noise. That can mean that you either have your belt too tight or you haven't quite got the wrap correct on this assembly. Now I want to take a few seconds and double check that the belt is in the grooves of each of these pulleys. Make sure that when I move it, it doesn't jump in or out. And just look at it from a bunch of angles and make sure that this seems like it's running the way I want. If I was building this on a robot, this is also the stage where I would grab a way to power this motor and drive it. Make sure that it sounds and looks appropriate when you're driving the motor as well. Next, we're going to go through the rigging process for the 4-stage Viper Slide kit. A lot of the other components, like the tension and working with the belt clamps, is the same, so I'll really only go through how you actually route the belt on this longer version of that kit. You'll notice that lots of the components are actually shared between these two kits. Obviously the slides and their accessories, but you'll also see the same pulley, the same hub, and that same idler. Like the 2-stage kit, we're going to take the end of this 2mm pitch belt and we're going to feed it up through the pulley and over the idler bearing. You'll also have to keep pulling this through the bearing. You'll have to back drive the motor as you go. Now, in this case, we're actually going to go down and under. We're going to go through the pulley shield on this idler, and the teeth side should be in contact with the bearing on this side. We're going to go directly over into the bearing that's also attached to that same low side U-channel. We're going to through this idler bearing and up and over through the next closest idler when the slide is extended. We're going to continue this exact process, going over to the far bearing that's on that same slide, and then up and back to the next stage's close bearing. Now, this exact route means that as we pull on the belt from the motor, we pull the slides out. We'll then go over to the bearing that's attached to that same slide, up through that pulley shield, and back to the closest bearing. It's pretty easy for the belt on the far side, so past the pulley, to get tangled. That's not really an issue as we're doing this, as long as the belt that is in the slide system stays in one orientation. We'll go over, up through that bearing, and we have found the last stage of this slide. So just like on the 2-stage, you'll go ahead and use those belt clamps to anchor this first belt, the first end of this belt, to the spacer that's assembled here. We can pull on the belt to make sure the slide is extended, and we can wrap this around the pulley, work out all of the tangles that we've made, and go down so that our return end of our belt can wrap around that same spacer as well. Similarly, you'll cut this belt to length, add that belt clamp, and adjust the tension to your liking. All right, we've got this wrapped around this spacer. I just want to visually go through and check and make sure I don't have any twists, and all of my belts are seated in their respective bearings. And we're going to go ahead and cut more belt than we could realistically need, just to get this excess out of our way. All right, at this stage, we'll go ahead and add our second belt clamp, creating a loop that's going to be close to the tension that we want. Slide that loop over the spacer, and we can retract our whole slide system just to make working with it a little bit easier. Now this is, again, significantly looser than I'd want it to be. So we'll pop that whole loop off of the slide system, add, I'm going to say probably 4 millimeters, so 4 of tension. Slide the belt clamp on over the loop, and we're going to slide that loop over that spacer. Now, in this application, when I've got way too much belt still remaining, I can make a really big loop, and that large loop buys us some additional tension. As we slide the clamp closer to the spacer here, you build up some tension in the system. Now that's pretty close. On the 4-stage, I like to have a little bit more tension than I do on the 2-stage, but we'll go ahead and cut this belt to length, again, leaving a pretty reasonable amount so that we can add or decrease tension later on. The important thing there is that when you fully retract the belt, you don't want the belt to be running up inside the pulley. And now you've got yourself either a 4-stage or a 2-stage Viper Slide kit rigged up and ready to put on your robot. And if you've got any questions about these or other parts we sell, don't hesitate to shoot us an email over to sales@gobuilda.com.